The honourable member for Barrie Innisfil.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The eyes of the nation are upon us tonight. Earlier today, the Prime Minister signalled, as did a member of his backbench, that tonight's vote is a confidence vote. Convention requires that the Prime Minister to publicly declare a confidence vote of this nature as such following convention. My question for the government House Leader is the vote tonight a confidence vote? And if the vote is lost, will the Prime Minister plunge us into an election?
The Honourable Government House Leader.
Mr. Speaker, I appreciate the debate, but it's time to vote.
Hear, hear.
The question is the following one. Mr. Medicino, seconded by Mr. Trudeau, moved that pursuant to Section 58 of the Emergencies Act, this House confirm the declaration of a public order emergency proclaimed on February 14, 2022. La période de 10 minutes pour les députés votants.
The 10-minute period for members voting electronically has started, and the House will now proceed to the vote for members participating in person. All those in favour of the motion will please rise.
Gabra.
Mr. Algabra.
Ms. Grove.
Ms. Grove.
Mr. McGuinty.
Mr. McGuinty.
Mr. Scarpellegia.
Ms. Scarpellegia.
Ms. Cara.
Ms. Cara.
Monsieur Vandal.
Mr. Vandal.
Monsieur McKinnon Gatineau.
Mr. McKinnon Gatineau.
Monsieur Miller.
Mr. Miller.
Mr. Mendicino.
Mr. Mendicino.
Monsieur Serré.
Mr. Serré.
Mr. Dhaliwal.
Mr. Dhaliwal.
Monsieur Arsenault.
Mr. Arsenault.
Monsieur Sanson.
Mr. Sanson.
Mr. Fillmore.
Mr. Fillmore.
Mr. Gerritsen.
Mr. Gerritsen.
Mrs. Romanado.
Mrs. Romanado.
Mr. Lamour.
Mr. Lamoureux.
Ms. Sahota.
Ms. Sahota.
Mr. Virani.
Mr. Virani.
Mr. Fergus.
Mr. Fergus.
Mr. Ananda Sangari.
Mr. Ananda Sangari.
Ms. Dillon.
Ms. Dillon.
Mr. Essasi.
Mr. Assassi.
Madame Mendez.
Madame Mendez.
Mr. Nagvi.
Mr. Nakvi.
Mr. Sidhu Brampton East.
Mr. Sidhu Brampton East.
Mrs. Suds.
Mrs. Suds.
Mr. Fragiscaros.
Mr. Fragiscatos.
Mr. Maloney.
Mr. Maloney.
Mr. Shifke.
Mr. Shifke.
Mr. Sorbara.
Mr. Sorbara.
Mr. Don.
Mr. Don.
Mr. Lewis Kitchener-Conestoga.
Mr. Lewis Kitchener-Conestoga.
Ms. Taylor-Roy.
Ms. Taylor-Roy.
Ms. Blaney.
Ms. Blaney.
Monsieur Boulris.
Mr. Boulris.
Madame Hughes.
Madam Hughes.
Ms. Matheson.
Ms. Matheson.
Ms. Idlov.
Ms. Idlov.
Ms. Barron.
Ms. Barron.
Ms. Maye-Saanich, Gulf Islands.
Ms. Maye-Saanich, Gulf Islands.
All those opposed to the motion will please rise.
Ms. Bergen.
Ms. Bergen.
Ms. Finlay.
Ms. Finlay.
Mr. Paulus.
Mr. Paulus.
Mr. Nater.
Mr. Nater.
Mr. Barlow.
Mr. Barlow.
Mr. Chong.
Mr. Chong.
Mr. Moore.
Mr. Moore.
Mr. Brassard.
Mr. Brassard.
Mr. Berthold.
Mr. Berthold.
Mr. Albus.
Mr. Aldous.
Ms. Danshaw.
Ms. Danshaw.
Mr. Macaulay Edmonton West.
Mr. Macaulay Edmonton West.
Mr. Schmale.
Mr. Schmale.
Mr. Tucker.
Mr. Tucker.
Mr. Baldinelli.
Mr. Baldinelli.
Mr. Lloyd.
Mr. Lloyd.
Mr. Lawrence.
Mr. Lawrence.
Mr. Duncan Stormont Dundas Salgangari.
Mr. Duncan Stormont Dundas Southern Gary.
Mr. Kimmich.
Mr. Kimmich.
Mr. Calkins.
Mr. Calkins.
Mr. Upal.
Mr. Upal.
Mr. Malillo.
Mr. Malillo.
Mr. Aitchison.
Mr. Aitchison.
Mr. Lobb.
Mr. Lobb.
Mr. Perkins.
Mr. Perkins.
Mrs. Gallant.
Mrs. Gallant.
Mr. Reed.
Mr. Reed.
Mr. Caputo.
Mr. Caputo.
Ms. Ferrari.
Ms. Ferrari.
Monsieur Martel.
Mr. Martel.
Monsieur Gourde.
Mr. Gould.
Mr. Steinley.
Mr. Steinley.
Ms. Rude.
Ms. Rude.
Madame Vien.
Madame Vien.
Ms. Lewis Haldeman Norfolk.
Ms. Lewis Alderman Norfolk.
Mrs. Block.
Mrs. Block.
Mr. Vierson.
Mr. Vierson.
Mr. Williamson.
Mr. Williamson.
Mr. McGuire.
Mr. McGuire.
Mr. Aboutaif.
Mr. Abouteyev.
Mr. Arnold.
Mr. Arnold.
Monsieur Généreux.
Monsieur Généreux.
Monsieur Deltel.
Monsieur Deltel.
Monsieur Godin.
Monsieur Godin.
Mr. Cooper.
Mr. Cooper.
Mr. Kelly.
Mr. Kelly.
Mr. Kitchen.
Mr. Kitchen.
Mrs. Stubbs.
Mrs. Stubbs.
Mr. Shields.
Mr. Shields.
Mr. Waugh.
Mr. Wall.
Mr. Weber.
Mr. Weber.
Mr. Motz.
Mr. Motz.
Monsieur Lew.
Mr. Lew.
Mr. Bragdon.
Mr. Bragdon.
Mr. Dalton.
Mr. Dalton.
Mr. Dowdle.
Mr. Dowdle.
Mr. Cram.
Mr. Cram.
Mr. Curek.
Mr. Curek.
Mr. Morrison,
Mr. Morrison,
Mr. Patzer,
Patzer,
Mr. Soroka,
Mr. Soroka,
Mr. Van Papta,
Mr. Van Papta,
Mr. Ruff,
Mr. Ruff,
Mr. Brock,
Mr. Brock,
Mr. Muse,
Mr. Muse,
Mrs. Roberts,
Mrs. Roberts,
Mr. Barrett,
Mr. Barrett,
Mr. Poiliev,
Mr. Polyev,
Monsieur
The honourable member for Kildonan.
Monsieur Sainte-Marie, Madame Normandin,
The honourable member for Kildonan St. Paul.
Mr. Speaker, the blockades have ended. Downtown Ottawa has been cleared. If there was ever a national emergency, which remains in doubt, it's over. So there is no need for the Emergencies Act vote tonight.
Monsieur Thériault,
Mr. Thériault,
Monsieur Perron,
Mr. Perron,
Monsieur Barsalou-Duval,
Mr. Barcelou Duval,
Monsieur Champoux,
Mr. Champoux.
The House will now wait for the electronic voting period to end before resuming its proceedings.